I was sitting over this side watching this guy play. What's that? Is that a viola thing or big cello? Big violin on the floor. That was sensational. Watching you do that thing. Then the guy is Mitch the guy in the beanie? He came and sat down. I thought, because I've been admiring his sort of hipster hillbilly look with his bush shirt on and his beanie on. And he sat on the seat, and I was thinking, don't pull out a flute or a trumpet, that won't work. When he pulled out a banjo, that fitted beautifully with the whole thing. And the song, not to lose focus on what we're singing about, Build Your Kingdom Here, that's what we're talking about this morning. We're talking about this kingdom story amongst all these other stories that clamour for our attention. There's a bigger story going on, and Daniel tells us that this story starts small and is getting bigger, and you and I are part of this big kingdom story. We're going to talk about that this morning. I notice there's a couple of you here this morning who weren't here last night and weren't here Thursday night. So once again, if someone can stand here, this book here, Andy Stanley asks, it's called The Revolutionary Question That Changes How You Go About Your Decision Making. Excellent book. If someone can tell me the consumer materialistic grid that we talked about on Thursday night, and also the one word that we talked about last night, you can give a couple of words, but a particular word where I said, this is what we do to one another, we turn each other into. Come up here. Marco? Yes. See, at least you got your name on the top. I know who you are. So Thursday night, we talked about time equals?
Money, which equals things, which equals happiness.
Excellent. And that's the grid we live by. That's the grid we give our life to. Tim Casser says 98% of us just live life that way. And that causes us to grow up in a way that we turn people into?
Commodities.
Well done. Well done, Marco. And we start treating people as product rather than God's children, and they lose their dignity when we treat people as commodity. Today we're talking about the power of story. And why is it when we can sing about it and talk about it that sometimes it seems so difficult to turn and change into a different story? We get caught in the stories, we get trapped in the stories. The story we grow up in, and for us it's Western consumer culture, can hold us and trap us. And today we're going to talk about how do we move out of that story. Neil Postman wrote a book called Entertaining Ourselves to Death. And he writes in there that what traps us in our stories, he says, is our lack of introspection. He says we don't take time to think anymore. We don't think about who we are and what we're giving our life to. He said our society is perfectly set up to stop us from having to think or be introspective. He says our entertainment is all out there. We don't have those long walks. We don't take that quiet time. We fill ourselves with, he says, we're addicted to noise. He says we crave noise, we love noise, and if we find a space where it could be quiet, we put things in our ears to make more noise. He says our addiction to noise means we don't have to think about who we are. We don't have to think about what we're giving our lives to. We don't have to think where we're headed. If we do start thinking that stuff, and if it does get a bit scary, he says we just turn on more noise. He says we're sacrificing life to a flickering screen. John Ortberg, in his book, The Life You Always Wanted, says, why do we get trapped in our stories? He says we get too busy to think about another story. We get too comfortable with how it is. He says we live in this fast-paced culture where we want to do everything fast. We want fast food. Everything has to move along at breakneck speed. He says we microwave life, but as he points out, a new story, a kingdom story, the story of Christ growing in and through you doesn't happen in a microwave. It doesn't happen at a breakneck speed. The voice of the Spirit, that quiet voice, the still small voice of the Spirit, gets lost in all this other clutter. It might be good, but maybe there's so much good that it crowds out the greater good. He says we get addicted to speed and noise and busyness. John Ortberg says that most of us suffer from what he calls hurry sickness. Do you want to do a test to see if you've got hurry sickness? If you've got hurry sickness, you just want to do stuff faster. You want to walk the dog faster. You want to read stories to your kids faster. You just want to do everything faster. You want to eat faster because you just have to do it fast, even if you don't have to do things fast. He says if you've got hurry sickness and you're driving down the road and there's a traffic light and you've got your choice of 2 lanes to line up in. He says if you've got hurry sickness, then you have the ability by some really weird equation to look at the make and model of each of those vehicles in that line and work out based on make and model which line you think is going to take off the fastest. And you find yourself pulling into the fast lane. Even if you don't have to get somewhere in a rush. That's just what you do. He says that if you're at the supermarket and you've got your line of products, and the really good is thing you can check out your own products so you can go faster than that person who would have been checking it out otherwise. You've got your basket of products, and there's the next person, and you look which line, you can scan all the lines of a very clever formula. You're able to work out which person, which line has the least amount of products to get through, and which person seems to be able to do that fastest. And you line up in there. And he says, if you've got a real bad case of hurry sickness, you choose the person that would have been you in the other line. And you watch them progress. And you watch yourself progress. And if they get out of the supermarket before you, you've lost. But if you get out first, you've won. You're a winner. And thanks for the invention of those, they call them assisted checkouts, but you don't find any assistants, where you just go up there and then you can do it flat out yourself until it says, do you hate it when it says remove that item from the bagging item? And you're thinking, there's no item in the bagging item. We get addicted to speed and hurry and busyness. And John Ortberg says that's what traps us in the story. Because he says one day goes to the next and the next and the next, and we think there's a better life out there somewhere. We at times go, I'm meant to be giving my life to a different grid. But he says the rush, the noise, and the busyness crowds it out. And he said pretty soon we get caught up living this life that we weren't supposed to be living, and we give our lives to things that don't really matter, like we talked about last night. Mark Griffith says, our story, the story we live in, he says the story we live at the moment is really hard to move out of. He, as a sociologist, he talks about our framing story. Sociologists talk about our big narratives and how we give our lives to stories. Now, I can't get my little thing. Here we go. He says there's 5 main stories. Whoops, that's not even mine. You know what? Doesn't matter. He says there's 5 main stories that we give our life to. He says one story, and he says whether it's your life on an individual scale, whether it's on a community scale, whether it's as a country. He says we give our lives to either the domination story, where in this story we think, well, I would be fine, I would have a peaceful, successful life if I could dominate, if I was in charge. If everyone did things my way, then the world would be okay. And so we choose to live this domination story. It happens in marriages. It happens in whole countries where we think, well, I'm in charge. It depends on me keeping you under. But then there's another story. And it becomes a result of the domination story. It's the revenge story. In the revenge story, it's, well, I'm sick of being kept under. And my life would be good, my story would be significant if I could get back at you. And so I spend my life trying to get revenge. There's the enemy, and I'm trying to get back control from you. Or then there's the purification story. In this story, it's, well, I'm now in charge, and I'm now in charge of the empire, or I'm now in charge of this, but it still hasn't worked out. We still don't have peace and security everywhere. It must be those people over there that are causing the trouble. It's those people who turned up here that are causing the trouble. It's those people from that country, or it's those people from that suburb, they're the trouble. And if we could get rid of those people, then we'll be okay. And this goes to very dangerous places. Extreme examples, Nazi Germany. It's those Jews, it's those people there. If we can get rid of them. Or we live the isolation story, where it's, well, let's just get away from all this. Let's make our own little community that's got nothing to do with everyone else, and let's only read stuff that we write, and let's only listen to music that we sing, and let's only look at things that we do, and let's shut ourselves up from everyone else. And we end up living an isolation story. Or there's a combination of all these different stories. These stories weren't new. In Jesus' time, when Jesus walked this planet, the Romans were the dominating force, and they were living out this kingdom, empire, domination story, and you do what the empire says. You had the revenge story, which was the zealots, and they're like, we're going to get back. They're going to have a great era, and we're going to get back at those Romans. You had the Pharisees living out a purification story. Stay away from those people over there. Those people have the problem. Or you had the Essenes, the isolation story. Let's build our own little community. And Jesus comes along and says, there's a different story. It's a kingdom story. And to those who are trying to dominate, what about you love your enemies? Love your enemies, huh? That's not the domination story. Or to the isolation story, Jesus says, what about if you become salt and light and you don't pull yourself back from the community, you become part of it? Or to the revenge story, Jesus is saying, what about those people who are trying to take your shirt? What about you give them your coat? And those people want to make you walk 1 mile. What about you to carry the load too? Jesus gives a totally different story. It doesn't make sense. And to all these different stories we define ourselves by, and sadly, often God and Christianity has been used to justify these stories, including Nazi Germany, where it's this, we're living out God's story, but really it's my story. In all these different stories, there's a bigger thing going on, and Jesus says, there's the Jesus story. It's a different way of doing life. Too often we take the Jesus story and simply dress it up to make it look like my story, but it's a domination story. I'm the head of this house, you do what I say. And we use scripture to sometimes justify that. That's not the Jesus story. It's a domination story, maybe dressed up as a Jesus story. Or it's we look after these people, and it's those people, they're the ones polluting the world, let's get rid of them. That's not a Jesus story. It's a purification story dressed up as a Jesus story. And we dress up all these other stories and make them look like supposedly Jesus stories. But let me tell you, there's a bigger thing going on, and there's a bigger story that you can be part of. And whichever story you're living out at the moment, there's another story there. The last 2 nights we've talked about the consumer story, which is the empire that we give our lives to. We find ourselves living in this consumer empire, and we fit in without even thinking, is what Paul says in Romans 12. In the Old Testament, you find a bunch of people living out a story. Every day they're making bricks. Every day more hay, more straw, more mud, more bricks to build more of the empire. They're the children of Israel, but they're living out this story where there's the domination story over the empire. They've become a commodity. Their only value is in what they produce. More bricks, more pyramids, more bricks, more temples, and let's up their quota. They have been stripped of their dignity apart from all you do is you're a machine. Then Moses comes along, called by God, and says, there's another story, guys. There's a promised land. Let's go. And you read the stories as they head to the promised land. We want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to the empire. We want to go back to where we're commodities. There's something about that it's comfortable over there. Out here, it's a bit risky. And is God really going to provide? Let's go back and be commodity. And every time you hear them grumbling, complaining, you're thinking, what's that all about? They're going back to these little commodity stories where they make bricks all day, when God's saying, here's a promised land, here's a whole new story, here's a new way of doing life, here's my kingdom story, and you get to be part of it. Yet they're so easily drawn back to where they were. As they're coming out, thank you for the water, by the way. As they're coming out of this commodity story, God gives them 10 commandments. 10 commandments are written in a way that's all about, let's give you dignity, let's give you a new story. The first commandments are all about, to God be the glory, put Him first. The consumer commodity story is, put self first, or honor celebrity, or worship empire. This is, God says, put me first. All through the commandments is give people dignity. Don't lie to them. Don't be mean to them. Give people dignity. And in Exodus 20, when the commandments are mentioned, it says, in the fourth commandment, in the middle of these commandments is this story, is this commandment that says, remember the Sabbath. Why is that one important? He says, because I created you. Here's the thing. Time equals money equals things equals happiness. What about if there was a day once a week? What about if there was one day in 7 where time didn't equal money? That would be a threat to the consumer grid. That would be resistance to consumer culture. What about if it's a day where I'm going to make this special day where you don't have to make the bricks. You're not what you make. You're not what you own. You remember that you belong to me. You remember that I created you. In this culture that you were in that took that story away from you, you remember you're a created being, that you're something special, that you're my child. Do you know what? As we view less of creation, or as Paul says, as the worship of God grows dim, we start worshipping created things, and that's most times ourselves. And God's saying, no, make this day where we take time to worship, we take time to be people, where we take time to remember who we are and where we came from, that I created you. When you read material that talks about consumerism, it says one of the things that breeds consumerism is our disconnection from creation, where we remove ourselves from created things and we forget who we are. As we believe more and more that somehow this planet just came to be and somehow we just came to be, the natural response is the consumer grid, because that's all there is between now and my last breath. There's no bigger story. All my life exists for is to fit as much consumption in between now and when I die. Where the 4th commandment says, no, remember the Sabbath. Remember that time doesn't equal money. Remember you're made for something more. And remember I'm your creator. By the time we get to in Deuteronomy chapter 5, the commandments are written out again. So you get the commandments written again. Once again, the 4th commandment says, remember the Sabbath. But it gives a totally different reason for it. It doesn't say, remember the Sabbath because I'm your creator. It says, remember the Sabbath because I brought you out of slavery. I brought you out of Egypt. This is remember the Sabbath because I brought you out of where you're a commodity for the empire. I brought you into a bigger picture. Remember the Sabbath because you're not slaves anymore. And so in the middle of this movement from the commodity form of life to here's a bigger picture, God says, here's a whole day, the day that we're celebrating right now, where he said, here is the resistance to the empire. Let's celebrate a day where we do think about what we're giving our life for. In a society that crowds us with noise and busyness, let's just stop. Let's take one day in 7 to quiet. Let's take a break from advertising. That's why I don't watch my telly on Sabbath, because I'm taking a break from this bombardment of thousands of messages. Let's not worry about having to do all the shopping. Let's take a break from the call of the mall, and let's just celebrate who we are as the children of God and who he created us to be. And let's think about this kingdom story of growing and serving, connecting and sharing and worshiping. And let's recalibrate what matters now. Let's recalibrate around significance for eternity. You don't have to produce on this day. You don't have to be part of this production system that puts value on my time. Let's live more than this. This is what God's saying to this group of people who he brings out and he's taking to their big story. Reality is, if ever we needed to have a space where we take a break from the run of life, whenever, as Paul says, we get dragged down to this society's level of maturity, we fit in without even thinking, if ever we need to take a thinking space, it's in the advanced consumer culture that you and I live. And with the Sabbath, we get this whole period of time where we say, let's think about who we really are. Let's take a break from all that and let's be God's children. Reality is, you and I live in a world that tries to shape us in all sorts of ways. We talked about that for the last 2 nights. But what's it look like to live a different story in there? Well, in the Bible, we're given an example of this different story. Then I'll talk about how we're going to live this different story. Daniel. Daniel, a teenage guy, some people say he was 15, possibly 16, growing up in Jerusalem, when he's taken from home and taken somewhere else and put in the middle of Babylon. Now, Babylon symbolizes a whole lot of things. It goes back to Genesis 11. Genesis 11 is Tower of Babel. Let's build a tower. Why does it say they're building a tower? Those of you who read Genesis 11, why are they building this tower? It says to make a name for ourselves, to take God out of the equation. God had sent this flood, and they're saying, well, we don't really trust that he's not going to do it again. So let us build a tower, make a name for ourselves, and take God out of the equation. Do you know what? Consumerism allows me to build a tower that takes God out of the equation, that makes a name for myself. Look at what I have made. And it allows me to remove my trust in God to trust in self. And sure, I believe he's there, but I don't really take him in his word, and I don't really trust him. And sure, I can sing he's all I need, but I don't know that. So let me build my little tower of consumerism just in case I need to take a bet on that one, in case that one doesn't work out. And so I build my own little Tower of Babel and take God out of the equation. So that's where the word Babylon comes from. Tower of Babel is Babylon. By the time we then move through, the next time we find Babylon is mentioned in Habakkuk, where Habakkuk's saying, God, why are the bad people winning and the good people losing? And God says, okay, I'm going to send Babylon to destroy you all. He goes, they're even worse. And God's saying, you know what, just watch what I'm doing. Even if I explained it, you wouldn't quite understand. But that's where we find Babylon. The next time we find Babylon is where we find Daniel dragged into Babylon. This is Babylon. This is Nebuchadnezzar, who's, look at Babylon that I have made. Babylon comes to stand for everything about self. Babylon is the empire. Babylon is the empire that calls for worship of self. Babylon is the empire that removes worship of God. And here is Daniel in the middle of Babylon. Reality is, you and I are far from home, living in Babylon. The culture we live in removes the worship of God. The culture we live in puts the focus on self. Any system, any empire, any system that's set up to remove the focus from worship of God and put it on self constitutes Babylon if we go through Scripture's images of Babylon. And that's where you and I live. We live in the middle of Babylon. But how can you survive and thrive in Babylon? This is what Daniel does so well. Because here's Daniel, 15, 16-year-old, he's dragged off to Babylon. In fact, they change his name. His name no longer is about I follow God, which is what his Daniel name was meaning. Your name is now Belshazzar, which means I honor Bel, another god. You can change his name. It says we're going to educate him in the Babylonian schools with the intention of we send him back to rule those people in Babylonian ways. So we're going to give him a Babylonian worldview. So he can sit in a Babylonian school with a Babylonian name, surrounded by Babylon. But here's the difference. In Daniel chapter 2, there's an incredible statement where he says, Daniel purposed in his heart. It comes back to what you purpose in your heart. Don't just get caught in the drift of the empire, but purpose something in your heart. Purpose what you're going to live your life for. Purpose what you're going to give your life to. He says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he wasn't going to defile himself. Now, we talk about this story in Daniel 2 where here's all the king's food, and some people say, well, it's Daniel trying to live out the health message, and he might have been. Or some people say it's because that if he ate at the king's table, that's giving allegiance to the king. It might have been. Some people say it's because the food was offered to idols, and that would be Daniel worshipping idols. It might have been. It might have been all of that stuff. Whichever one is the correct answer, we do know that here we have a young man who say, I live for another system. I'm living here, but my heart belongs somewhere else. And you can surround me with Babylon. You can put all this stuff everywhere around me. But I know that in the middle of this big Babylon empire story, there's another story going on. And there's a God who's working in me. And his way is greater than your way. And I'll honor him. And Daniel makes all these seemingly little decisions that later on, as the stakes get higher, it doesn't matter for him. If you pray by your window, we're going to throw you to the lions. It doesn't matter because he's going to do his day God's way anyway. And you see all through. Now, it helps that he's got friends who encourage him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, friends who also, on the plain of Dura, take a stand when worship is called somewhere else. And it's always about worship. Consumerism. The big problem with consumerism is it diverts my worship. It gets me worshipping things and products and celebrity instead of God. As the worship of God grows dim, Paul says, we worship created things, and most times that's ourselves and celebrity. And so in Daniel, we find this example of this guy living with a worldview all around him, Babylon, but he's saying there's a different way to do this. I will honor my God, whatever. Now, he thrives in Babylon. He ends up being ruler of over big groups of people, so he's doing well. So you can do well in Babylon, but remember who your heart belongs to. Take time to be introspective. It says Daniel took that time and he had heart-building habits where he prayed and he turned his face to his God and he prayed and he kept recalibrating. Keep recalibrating because Babylon takes you down to its level of immaturity really quick. Sabbath is a recalibration point, but you're going to need recalibration points throughout your day because otherwise you get caught in that drift. So you need to create some recalibration points. I don't know what that's going to be in your day. It might be kneeling by your window to pray. It might be a walk. It might be just taking little Sabbath moments in your day where you recalibrate around the fact that you're living far from home in Babylon, but your heart belongs somewhere else. You have a different story. You're not living out this empire story. By the time we get to Revelation chapter 14, does anyone know what Revelation chapter 14 is talking about? Have any of you been to some churches where you see these three angels on the wall? Yeah? And you thought, what's those three things? But the three angels, we say we're a church of three angels. Guess what the three angels talk about? Keeping in mind that I think everything's about consumerism. What do the three angels talk about? Consumerism. Yes, they do. Let me tell you how. Because angel number 1 in Revelation 14 says, is all about worship. Worship him who created everything. There's an angel flying saying, it's about worship, and it is about worship. And the issue at the end times is always about worship. The issue at any time is always about worship. It's about where your heart is, who has your heart, what's your allegiance to. And that's what the first angel's talking about. Then there's another angel. And that angel says, does anyone know what the second angel's going to tell us? Well done, Babylon has fallen. This system that set itself up to remove the worship of God, and all through history there's been different systems doing this. This system that has removed the worship of God and put worship on self, and whether it be religious systems. Now, Craig Bartholomew and William Kavanagh have written 2 excellent books saying consumerism is our religious system in our empire today, that it is our meaning-making system, that it does take faith and desire, it does give us our story we live in. They're saying consumerism is religion. So these religious systems that remove the worship of God are fallen. It's saying you're living in Babylon, but Babylon falls over. And all this stuff we're giving our lives to doesn't stack up in the end. Does anyone know what the third angel says? That's the really cool angel. I mean, they're all really cool angels. He says, he's the one talking about this mark on your forehead. He's saying, whoever gets this 666, what's that got to do with consumerism? Guess what? Everything. Because this mark we talk about 666 is simply saying, this is the number the Hebrews used to designate a system that had so far lost its way, that had removed itself from the worship of God and was now actively working against God. That's the number they used for it. If you look in 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 14, there you find Solomon. Solomon, who was the wisest guy on the planet. Solomon, who was enacting God's rule through his kingdom. But things start to change. And in chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba comes to visit to see, where did this guy's wisdom come from? And guess what Solomon did? He doesn't say my wisdom comes from God, which is what Daniel did, by the way. When the king says, you're very wise, he goes, my wisdom comes from God. It's not about me, it's about God, is what Daniel says. But Solomon goes, wow, Queen of Sheba, look at all my things, look at all my fineries, look at all my armaments, look at all my gold, look at all my spices, look at all the stuff I've got. And the prophet comes to him and says, when the Queen of Sheba came, what did you show her? I showed her everything. He doesn't say it's about God, like Daniel chose to say. Daniel says, my clever mind, it's not even mine, it's God's. My ability to interpret dreams, it's not even me, it's God's. Daniel remembers that everything, absolutely everything, is from God and is for God's glory. Daniel says, anything I can do is for God. Now Solomon's saying, look at all my stuff. And if you read 1 Kings 10:14, it says the weight of his gold was 666. When he's defined himself by his things, when the worship of God has been subverted and now he's worshipping products and things, when he defines himself by the empire system rather than God's news story, he says that's when the weight of his gold is 666. And the third angel is saying, guys, you live in a time surrounded by Babylon. All these things are crowding for your attention. All these systems, like consumerism, are asking you to worship products rather than God, as trying to subvert the worship that belongs to God to things. And that's a dangerous place to be, the third angel says. So, you and I belong to a tribe, a denomination, a group of people, a community of believers who say we take these three angels seriously. And you know, if there's ever a time, then there's that message at three angels that, hey, what are you worshipping? What are you giving your life to? Babylon has fallen. Don't have your worship subverted to things or man-made systems. If ever that message is really important, it's now. Because you and I live in a world where that urgency is increasingly being lived out. A lady called Laura Hartman. She's a scholar at Oxford University. That's where really, really smart people go, apparently. So I'm assuming she's really, really smart because she's at Oxford. She wrote an excellent book called The Christian Consumer. Now, most of it is about how, as Christians, we should be more caring of our environment, and as Christians, we should make consumable decisions based on the impact of our planet, because as Christians, we're meant to remember that we're created beings and that God puts us in this creation to care for it. But then she talks about, and lots of people who write about consumerism, they get criticised for seeing all the problems but not seeing answers. That's the criticism of most books on consumerism, that, hey, it's easy to say all the problems, which we've done the last 2 nights, but where's some answers in all this? And so she starts saying, well, here's an answer. She's not part of our Adventist tribe, by the way, but she says, here's an answer. She goes, there's a group of people who once every 7 days take a break from consumerism. There's a group of people who decide that time doesn't equal money for a whole period of 24 hours. And she said that recalibrates how they think about the rest of their life and the rest of their week. She said there's a group of people who have this health message idea, and for them the health message is not about worship of their own body, which she says that health, this big health fad in our community, she says is largely about consumerism and worshipping of myself. She says, no, they believe that they belong to God. They believe they're here for a different reason. She said there's a group of people who believe in a bigger story than this. They don't believe the world is their home. They believe that there's another story going on, and they believe they're part of a bigger story, even though they involve themselves in this story. And she said they have this large aid agency, and she mentions ADRA, where they're making a difference on the planet now, but they believe there's a bigger story going on, so they don't get caught in these little stories. She says this group of people are, she's a Seventh-day Adventist. And you know how you are when you're studying, you've got a pile of books late at night time, and you're reading all these books on consumerism, and I get to this book and I'm flicking through it. What's this lady say? And you know when you see, like if you see your own name somewhere, it sticks out. Then when you see Seventh-day Adventist written anywhere, what? I read it to a group of our pastors in Sydney, and one of the pastors says, what if we were that? And it's true. Do you know what? Reality is I'm more convinced than ever that this tribe, this group of people have a message that our world needs more now than ever. The Sabbath is more relevant than ever. The emphasis, the way we interpret God's message, the way we live out His story is more important now than ever. And you get to be part of it. It is the revolution in the empire that's saying, here, give your life to consumer empire, give your life to this, put your hopes and dreams here, find hope and meaning here, invest your desire here. Amongst all that, I did have a hanky, but I get too excited. I'm not about to have a heart attack, by the way, I just sweat lots. And amongst all of that, there's this other story going on. And there's a group of people who have been put on this planet at this time, at this place, to show the world there's a different way of doing it. You can be in the world, but not of it. You can be surrounded by Babylon, but not be Babylon. You can show that there's a different way, that your heart belongs to somewhere else. You're living to the beat of a different drum. And that's what we can be. That's what we're called to be. Do you know what? We're called to be the revolution. The revolution our planet needs at the moment is not some political system that's going to solve it. They're playing domination stories, revenge stories, purification stories, isolation stories. They're playing out all those other stories. You and I get to be part of the Jesus story. And that's the most exciting thing you can give your life to between now and the day you die. You give your life to the same thing that Daniel did, living out a life that honors God in the middle of Babylon. Because that matters now, and that matters for eternity. It's always about worship. It's always about what you determine in your heart. It's always about what story you're giving your life to. And amongst all these other framing stories, the kingdom story is the story. In the book of Daniel, it says, that becomes a whole mountain that fills the earth. At the moment, you might think, it looks like this other story is winning. But that second angel said, it falls, it crumbles. And amongst all that, there's a Jesus kingdom story. And he wants to live that story out in you and me. And a community that shows the world what happens when a group of people live life God's way. There's a story that puts Jesus at the center of all our decisions. And whatever decision comes our way, whatever we're asked to do or give our life to, when Jesus is at the center, we have a story that we frame ourselves by. Am I living a Jesus story that serves more than I am served? Am I living a Jesus story where I invest myself into community? Am I living in a Jesus story where it's not about having to get back at my enemies? I'm going to pray for them. And Jesus says, pray for your enemies and those who despitefully use you. Is it a story where I'm going to be salt and light? And a story where whatever happens, whatever the stakes, I might be Daniel feeling I'm all alone in Babylon, but I'm going to worship my God anyway because there's nothing else worth living for. If you think this life is it and there's nothing beyond now, then consume all you want because there's nothing else to it. But you know, this life is not it. You belong to a bigger picture. You belong to a God who loves you deeply. He created you for far greater purposes. And that's worth giving your life to. That's worth investing your hopes and dreams in. That's the life of significance that makes a difference now and matters for eternity. So as we sing this song about Jesus being the center, think about your story. Think about what you're living out. Think about what you're giving your life to. Think about what it looks like when Jesus is the center. And in our next few meetings at camp, we're going to talk more about what that looks like when we put Jesus at the center and what some of those answers are in living the Jesus story. Dear Lord, as we sing about life being all about you and you being the center, may this truth become a reality in our lives. May you be the center of our lives, the center of our church, the center of the spaces where we live. And even living in a world surrounded by Babylon, may we each day find space to recalibrate about life being all about you. May you dwell richly in us, work in and through us now. Amen.